Here's part 1 of Fisherman disappeared in 1987, decades later. His boat surfaced with a terrifying secret written in the same style you prefer. It began with a name that had faded from memory. In 1987, along the Maine coastline whispered about a man named Thomas Barlow. To some, he was a loner. To others, he was simply a fisherman trying to make a living in waters that were becoming harder to trust. His boat, the Windbreaker, was a familiar sight on the horizon, usually slipping out at dawn and returning long after the sun had sunk into the sea. But on one summer morning, Thomas sailed out and never came back. The Coast Guard searched for days. His nets were found drifting, tangled with seaweed and empty hooks. Pieces of rope, frayed as though they had been sawed apart, floated in the surf. The Windbreaker itself was gone. No distress call had ever been made. No radio message sent. It was as though the man and his vessel had vanished into the Atlantic without a trace. Locals speculated endlessly. Some believed a storm pulled him under. Others said Thomas had debtsmen from out of town had been asking about him and maybe he staged his disappearance. But there were darker theories, the kind only told late at night in hushed tones, that the waters off the coast were cursed. That sometimes the sea didn't just take it kept. His disappearance soon became another unsolved mystery added to Maine's long maritime history. Within a year, Thomas Barlow was a name spoken only in passing, his story reduced to a cautionary tale for children who dared wander too close to the jagged cliffs. And then, 36 years later, his boat came back. It was a summer morning. In 2023, nearly identical to the day Thomas vanished, a lobster fisherman named Caleb Turner was checking his traps when he noticed something unusual drifting on the tide. At first, he thought it was just wreckage, a mass sticking up, worn smooth, with barnacles. But as he approached, the shape grew clearer. The boat was small, weather-beaten, and unmistakably old. The name, though faded, was still there on the stern, carved deep into the wood. The Windbreaker, Caleb said later that what struck him first was how intact the boat was. The paint was peeled, the ropes shredded, but the hull was solid. The vessel looked aged by decades of storms but not destroyed. It was as though it had been preserved, waiting. When authorities hauled it into harbor, the village gathered to see. Though some recognized the name immediately. Old fishermen, men who had been Thomas's peers, stood with their caps in hand, muttering that the sea had finally given him back. Younger onlookers asked questions that no one could answer. Where had it been? How could it have floated all these years unseen? But the real horror came when investigators climbed aboard. Inside the cabin, beneath warped planks and rusted nails, they found something sealed away, trapdoor nailed shut from the outside. When pried open, it revealed a small compartment. No larger than a coffin. Within it lay bones, human bones curled in on themselves, as if whoever was inside had been clawing for escape. The medical examiner confirmed it. The remains were old, far older than the average missing person case. They likely dated back to the late 1980s, and lodged in the bones of the left hand was a jagged piece of wood. A splinter from the inside of the trapdoor, driven deep into the phalanges, as if the victim had died trying to punch or pry their way out. It was assumed at first that the body was Thomas Barlow himself. But when DNA testing came back weeks later, the results shocked everyone. The bones did not belong to him. They belonged to someone else. Someone no one had reported missing. Someone who, according to the coroner, had been shut inside that hidden compartment while still alive. The discovery turned the long-forgotten mystery of Thomas Barlow's disappearance into something far darker. What had happened on that boat in 1987? Who was the person sealed inside? If it wasn't Thomas in the trapdoor, then where was he? The police reopened the case, sifting through decades-old evidence. Families came forward, claiming the bones might belong to lost relatives, though none matched so far. But those who lived in the village began recalling strange details they had ignored. Back then, settling things about Thomas's final weeks before he vanished. One fisherman remembered seeing Thomas arguing on the docks with a stranger, a man with a scar down his cheek. Another recalled how Thomas had started drinking heavily, muttering about how the sea wasn't right anymore, and how something out there wanted him. And then there was the widow of a sailor who swore she'd seen the windbreaker drifting miles offshore days after the Coast Guard had ended their search, moving without sails, without crew, silently gliding through the fog. Theories grew darker still. Had Thomas locked someone inside his own boat and fled? Had he been killed for what he knew? Or had the windbreaker itself become something else entirely, an empty vessel, carrying the secrets of whatever had happened in those final hours? What no one could explain was why, after more than 3 decades, the boat had suddenly resurfaced, almost as if it wanted to be found, and the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a missing fisherman. It was about something much older, much stranger, and far more terrifying than anyone in the village could have imagined, because the trapdoor wasn't the only thing hidden on that boat, and what they found next would change everything. The town of Harrington had always lived with the ocean as both provider and predator. Families there had buried fathers and brothers lost to storms, and wives had waited on porches that faced an empty horizon. Death at sea was understood, but what the windbreaker carried back with it was different and natural. Detective Ellen Marks was the one assigned to the reopened investigation. She was in her 50s now, but in 1987 she had been a rookie officer, fresh from the academy. And she remembered when Thomas Barlow disappeared, remembered standing on the pier as the Coast Guard brought in what little debris they found. She remembered the way the town grew quiet whenever his name was mentioned. And now, decades later, it was her case again. The bones pulled from the hidden compartment had been cataloged, photographed, and sent for DNA analysis. The results confirmation that the remains weren't Thomas Barlow spread through Harrington like wildfire. If Thomas wasn't the one in the trapdoor, then who had he been with? More importantly, where was he? When Ellen first stepped onto the windbreaker, the smell hit her. It wasn't rot, too many years had passed for that, but something older. Gear. As though the boat had carried damp secrets that never dried. The wood was spongy in places, cracked in others, but structurally, it was intact. The ocean had weathered it, but hadn't destroyed it. She found that detail deeply unsettling. The compartment where the body was discovered told its own story. The interior was gouged with frantic scratches, grooves torn into the wood by fingernails and splinters. In places, the marks were layered, as if the victim had clawed until fingers bled, then clawed again. A small metal button had been found wedged between 2 planks, not from Thomas's clothes, but from something else. Ellen stood there, her flashlight sweeping over the worn cabin, and felt a heaviness press in. She had worked dozens of cases, some brutal, some tragic. But there was something about this boat that carried a different weight. It wasn't just a crime scene, it felt like a witness. The Coast Guard report from 1987 was thin. A storm had passed through the area the week Thomas vanished, but nothing catastrophic. Witnesses on shore reported seeing the windbreaker leave early that morning, after that silence. No distress call, no SOS. The assumption had always been that he was lost at sea. But the presence of the body complicated everything. Ellen requested access to old case files stored in the county archive. Dust-covered boxes, brittle with age, revealed names that had been forgotten. People who had been questioned. One in particular stood out, Daniel Harker. Daniel had been a dock worker, 23 at the time, who told investigators he had seen Thomas arguing with someone on the pier the night before he vanished. The report listed the man only as unidentified stranger. Carter claimed he didn't know who it was. But Ellen noticed something odd. The report noted that Carter moved away only weeks later, never to return. She called her contact at the DMV to run the name. Carter had resurfaced in Vermont under a different trade mechanic. Still alive? Still reachable. That same day, she visited the local historical society to dig deeper into Thomas Barlow himself. There weren't many photos. He hadn't been the kind to smile for cameras. One black-and-white image showed him standing beside his boat, a cigarette in hand, his eyes shadowed beneath his cap. Locals described him as quiet, but restless. Restless was the word that came up again and again. He owed debts. He drank. He spoke of the ocean in ways that unnerved people. And then Ellen found something strange. A letter, preserved in an envelope, written by Thomas to his younger brother weeks before his disappearance. The letter was never mailed. It had been donated by the family years later, tucked into the archives. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "There's something in the water. I've seen it. Not fish, not whale. Something that shouldn't be. I hear it sometimes at night knocking on the hull like it's asking to come in. I don't sleep anymore. If I don't come back, tell them it wasn't an accident." Ellen read the letter 3 times, her skin prickling with unease. If it was a drunken ramble, it was a convincing one. If it was a confession, it was terrifying. That night, she returned to the pier where the windbreaker was moored under guard. The tide lapped at its sides, the moonlight painting its weathered frame. She climbed aboard alone, her flashlight catching on the warped planks. She felt drawn to the cabin, to the trapdoor, to the shadows beneath. And that's when she noticed it's something the first search team had missed. Carved into the underside of the cabin's table were letters, jagged and crude as though scratched. In haste with a knife, the words were barely legible, eroded by time, but she could still make them out. "IT follows." The next morning, Ellen received a call from the coroner's office. They had identified the bones, not by DNA, but by an old healed fracture in the femur and dental records from the 1980s. The victim wasn't Thomas Barlow. It was Daniel Carter, the same man who claimed he saw Thomas arguing with someone the night before the disappearance. The same man who supposedly moved away and started a new life. The same man. Ellen had just looked up in Vermont, which raised a question she couldn't begin to answer. If Daniel Carter had been locked inside the windbreaker in 1987, Detective Ellen Marks sat in her car long after the call ended, coroner's words echoing in her head. The body belonged to Daniel Carter. She had spent the previous day combing through Carter's modern records as mechanic's license. A modest house in Vermont, a driver's registration renewed only last year. All the signs of a living, breathing man. Yet now she was being told the real Carter had died in 1987, locked inside a coffin-sized compartment on a boat that had only just resurfaced. Her first thought was identity theft. Someone had assumed Carter's name after his disappearance. But the longer she stared at the coroner's report, the less sense it made. Dental records don't lie. The bones in the windbreaker were Daniel Carter's, which meant whoever had been living under his name for the past 36 years wasn't him at all. The problem was, Carter had a documented trail photographs, employment records, even a marriage license. Though his wife had died of cancer in the 2000s, he wasn't some shadow living off the grid. He had lived openly as Daniel Carter for decades. Neighbors in Vermont knew him. Colleagues drank beers with him after shifts. His existence wasn't a paper ghost. Ellen wrote in her notebook, if Carter died in 87, then who took his place? How did no one notice? Where does Thomas Barlow fit? She knew she needed to see Carter for herself. The next morning, she drove north. The August sun poured over pine forests, but Ellen's thoughts stayed dark, circling the windbreaker. The frantic scratches on the wood, the words carved under the table, "It follows." Vermont was quiet farmland and long, winding roads. When she pulled into the graveled driveway of Carter's listed residence, she felt an unease settle into her chest. The house was simple. One story, pale paint flaking, a collapsed barn behind it. The car was parked out front, its hood dusted with pollen. She knocked. The door opened after a pause. The man who stood there was in his 70s, thin but sturdy, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to alert for his age. "Yes," he asked, voice rough. "Mr. Carter?" Len said carefully. He nodded once. "That's me." She studied his face. Weathered, leathery skin, creases deepened by years of labor. If she hadn't known better, she would have believed him. But she did know better. The real Carter's bones were lying in a coroner's office back in Maine. "I'm Detective Marks," she said, showing her badge. "I'm here about an investigation that concerns you." Something flickered across his face, something quick, gone in an instant. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The interior smelled faintly of oil and metal shavings, the scent of a mechanic who brought his work home. Photographs lined the mantel. Carter in his younger years, holding up a fish beside a smiling woman, Carter at a barbecue with friends. All perfectly ordinary. Ellen sat across from him, notebook ready. It's Carter. Record show, you once lived in Harrington, Maine, in the 1980s. Do you remember that? He gave a dry chuckle. That was a lifetime ago. I left when I was young. Why? He shrugged. Work. Opportunities. The town didn't have much for me. His answers were smooth. Ellen had questioned enough suspects to recognize rehearsed lines. What about Thomas Barlow? She asked suddenly. The name hung heavy in the air. For a moment, Carter didn't move. Then he smiled faintly, though his eyes didn't. I haven't heard that name in years. You knew him? Everyone in Harrington knew him. Fisherman, bit of a loner. Did you argue with him the night before he disappeared? That flicker again? The tiniest stiffening of the jaw? No, she leaned forward. Mr. Carter, this is important, because the man who vanished wasn't just Thomas. It was you. And yesterday, your remains were identified in a boat that came back after 36 years at sea. Silence. The ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, Carter laughed. A low, rasping sound that seemed forced. That's ridiculous. As you can see, I'm very much alive. But Ellen wasn't convinced. The way he said it wasn't denial. It was dismissal, like someone amused by a game. She stood. I'll need you to come with me, sir, for questioning. That's when his expression changed. The smile slipped. His eyes sharpened, cold as steel. Detective, he said softly, you don't want to dig into this. It's not for your sake. The hair on Ellen's arms rose. His tone wasn't threatening. It was warning. Almost pitying. She left soon after, unsettled. Driving back, she couldn't shake his words. Not for your sake. And when she replayed the conversation, one detail stuck out. When she mentioned Thomas Barlow. Carter hadn't asked how his name came up, or why it was connected to her visit. He already knew. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. Old letter Thomas had written, the one that had never been sent. There's something in the water. I hear it knocking on the hull. She stared at those words until the letters blurred. And then, just before she finally closed her eyes, she thought she heard it too. A faint, hollow tapping, like knuckles rapping on wood, coming from somewhere in her house. The tapping woke her again. Detective Ellen Marks sat upright in bed, her heart thudding in her chest. At first she thought it was a dream, the echo of Thomas Barlow's words infecting her sleep. But as she sat still, ears straining in the silence, she heard it clearly. Knock, 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 rhythmic, deliberate. It came from somewhere inside her house. She grabbed her service pistol from the nightstand and crept into the hall. The house was old, full of creaks and sighs, but this sound was different. It was precise, like knuckles against wood. She followed it toward the kitchen. The sound stopped. Her breath fogged faintly in the air. A draft slipped under the back door. Though the night was warm, she flicked on the light. Nothing. Just her kitchen, ordinary and still. But when she turned to leave, her eyes fell on the table. 3 small gouges, fresh and raw, marred the underside of the wood. They hadn't been there before. Her mind flashed to the windbreaker, to the desperate scratches inside the hidden compartment. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, she drove straight to the coroner's office, demanding another. Look at the bones, Dr. Harris. A man who had worked morgues for 30 years, reluctantly agreed. They stood over the remains laid out on a sterile steel table. Harris pointed out the evidence, again the old fracture in the femur. The dental record matches the bone density consistent with a man in his 20s at time of death. It's Carter, Harris said firmly. There's no question. Then, who's in Vermont? Ellen asked. Harris gave her a look. You're asking me to solve something that doesn't add up. All I can tell you is that this man died inside that boat a long time ago. Ellen leaned closer. She noticed something strange on the ribsteiny pockmarks etched into the bone, almost circular. "What are these?" Harris frowned. "That's what I've been wondering. They're not bullet holes, not knife marks, most like corrosion. But bones don't corrode like this." He paused. "Unless something was eating at them." The idea lodged in Ellen's chest like a splinter. She asked him to run additional analysis, anything that might explain it. Later that day, she received a call from the Maine Historical Society. They had found something unusual in their maritime archives, an old logbook from 1912, belonging to a fisherman named Josiah Heller. The archivist read aloud a passage that made Ellen's stomach drop. The sea was calm, yet the knocking came. "Again. Last night at first I thought it rats in the hall. But then I heard it from the waterline beneath the boards. Men say it is the drowned asking for entry. I fear if we let it in, none of us will return." The archivist laughed nervously, saying it was probably sailor superstition. Ellen didn't laugh. That evening, she sat in her car outside Carter's Vermont home, watching, hear whoever he was, moved through the kitchen, making dinner like any ordinary man. But Ellen couldn't shake the memory of his words, not for your sake. She decided to confront him again, when she knocked this time. He answered more quickly as though expecting her. "You came back," he said softly. "Who are you?" Ellen asked. "I told you already," he said. "I'm Daniel Carter." "No, you're not." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just looked at her, those sharp blue eyes glinting in the porch light. Then he said something that chilled her to the bone. "You've heard it, haven't you?" Ellen's throat went dry. "Heard what?" "The knocking." His smile was slow, eerie. "It's looking for another door." Before she could respond, the porch light above them flickered. The night air grew heavy, pressing in on her ears. Somewhere distant but close enough to feel, she heard it again. Knock, 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 not on wood this time. On water, like something rapping from beneath the surface of a vast, unseen sea. She staggered back, heart racing. But Carter only stood there, calm, almost reverent. "It followed him home," he whispered, "and now it follows you." Ellen left, shaken to her core. That night she sat at her desk, reviewing Thomas Barlow's unsent letter again. The words blurred as exhaustion crept in. "If I don't come back, tell them it wasn't an accident." Ellen realized then that Thomas hadn't been warning his brother. He had been leaving instructions for whoever came after, because he knew. And now, stood she. The windbreaker wasn't just a boat, it was a vessel. A door, and something on the other side was still knocking. Ellen Marks barely recognized herself in the mirror the next morning. Her eyes were bloodshot, her skin pale, her nerves raw.
Oh.
She hadn't slept. Every time her eyelids closed, she heard the sound again, faint, hollow, relentless. Knock, knock. Knocked. Her rational mind insisted it was stress, her imagination twisting old sailors' tales into hallucinations. But a part of Hertha, part that had stared into the windbreakers rotten. Plankson felt a presence pressing back, knew better. She needed answers. Instead of returning to Harrington immediately, Ellen drove to Boston. It's the Massachusetts Institute of Marine Research housed specialists who occasionally consulted with law enforcement on maritime cases. She requested a private meeting with Dr. Leah Grayson, an oceanographer known for her work on deep-sea anomalies. Leah raised an eyebrow when Ellen placed Thomas Barlow's letter on her desk. "You want me to evaluate this?" "I want to know," Ellen said, "if there's anything in the water off Harrington that could explain. Noises, knocking, something sailors would interpret as alive." Leah skimmed the letter, frowning. "Whales make knocking sounds. So do certain fish, like drumfish. But they wouldn't produce something rhythmic against a hull." That sounds more like, she hesitated. "Impact, pressure waves, maybe from shifting seabeds. Could it happen repeatedly?" "Over years." Leah shook her head. "Unlikely." Ellen pushed further. "What if I told you multiple accounts, spanning over a century, all described it the same way? knocking, asking to be let in. Leah's expression tightened. They didn't say it isn't geological. What then? Hesitated. There are patterns in the ocean we don't understand. Sounds recorded in the deep that don't match any known animal. The sea is old, older than anything on land. If sailors were hearing something that consistent, she tapped the letter, then maybe they weren't imagining it. Left more unsettled than before. When she returned to Harrington, the town was buzzing. News of the windbreaker's discovery had spread beyond the county. Reporters swarmed the docks, snapping photographs, asking about the coffin in the boat. Locals muttered about curses. Old men at the bar swore they'd heard knocking themselves. Back when they were boys, but one story caught Ellen's ear. A lobsterman claimed his traps, been dragged miles from where he'd set them. Another swore something had brushed against the bottom of his boat, something massive, though sonar showed nothing. The sea, it seemed, was stirring. That night, Ellen returned to the pier. The windbreaker sat in the harbor, creaking softly. The guard posted to watch it smoked a cigarette, half asleep. Ellen climbed aboard alone. The boat felt heavier now, as though it carried not just weight, but memory. Over the carved words again, T follows. And then she saw something new. A wet streak running down the inside of the cabin wall. Salt water, fresh, glistening, as though the sea itself had leaked inside. But the tide hadn't risen high enough to flood the boat. The water had come from within. She reached out. The wood was damp, almost pulsing beneath her fingers. And then she heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Not from the hole this time. From beneath the trapdoor. The one they had pried open to recover Carter's bones. The one that was now sealed again, though no one had closed it. Her breath caught. Slowly she backed away. The knocking grew louder, faster, as though sensing her retreat. She stumbled onto the deck, nearly dropping her flashlight. Behind her, the guard shouted, "Detective, you okay?" But Ellen didn't answer. She stood, frozen, watching as the trapdoor inside the cabin began to bulge upward, nails groaning, but splintering as though something underneath was pushing to get out. The sound rose to a furious pounding, and then silence. The wood settled. The air stilled. Ellen forced herself to breathe. She climbed off the boat, her legs trembling. The guard gave her a curious look. "What happened in there?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "Nothing at all." But she knew she was lying. That night, she drove back to her motel, her mind racing. She poured herself a glass of water, sat heavily on the bed, and tried to steady her nerves. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She answered, "Detective Marks." A voice rasped on the other end low, hoarse and eerily familiar. "You opened the door?" She froze. "Who is this?" "Shouldn't have gone back on the boat." The line crackled, water dripping faintly in the background. Ellen's hand tightened on the phone. "Thomas Barlow," she whispered. The voice gave a wet, ragged laugh. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is this: once it knocks, it doesn't stop. Not until someone lets it in." The line went dead. Ellen sat in the silence, her pulse hammering, the phone cold in her hand. And then, from the bathroom, knock. Knock. Her glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Here is part 6 of Fisherman disappeared in 1987, decades later. His boat surfaced with a terrifying secret. The knocking in the bathroom froze Ellen in place. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her motel room was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the carpet. Slowly, she raised her pistol and stepped toward the bathroom door. Knock, knock, knock. She pushed the door open. The light flickered. The mirror above the sink was fogged, though no shower had run. Water dripped steadily from the faucet into the basin, though she hadn't turned it on. The knocking stopped the moment she crossed the threshold. The silence was worse. She touched the mirror. It was damp, as though someone had exhaled against it from the other side. When she pulled her hand back, 3 streaks appeared on the glasses. Though wet fingers had dragged downward, Her phone buzzed again, vibrating against the nightstand. She turned, heart hammering, and hurried to it. "Another unknown number," she answered, voice shaking. "Who is this?" A long pause. Then the same rasping voice as before. "You shouldn't have touched the boat." Ellen's throat tightened. "Thomas? Is that you? Not Thomas?" The voice sounded like water moving through pipes, distorted, gargling. Thomas opened the first door. "You opened the next." Her pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" The voice chuckled. "Wet and hollow? It doesn't want me. It wants you." The line went dead. Ellen sat there, gripping the phone until her knuckles went white. She wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but she couldn't ignore the sound she'd heard in the windbreaker, or the words carved under the table, or the stains of seawater where no tide had touched. And then she realized something that chilled her to the bone. If the body in the trapdoor was Daniel Carter, then who had sealed him inside? The next morning, she returned to the docks. Reporters had multiplied, circling like gulls, shouting questions at anyone in uniform. The sheriff waved her over. "Marks," he said, pulling her aside. "You've got a mess on your hands. We've got people saying the boat's haunted. Kids sneaking down at night, trying to get a look. We can't keep this under wraps much longer." "Then don't," Ellen said. "Let the rumors spread. Maybe it'll keep people away." He frowned. "What's really going on here?" Didn't answer. Instead, she walked back onto the windbreaker. The air inside was heavier now, thick with damp salt. The damp streak she'd touched the night before had spread, dark veins of moisture crawling through the wood. She crouched near. The trapdoor? Flashlight in hand? The nails sealing it were new, hammered in by investigators after Carter's remains were removed. But something had warped the wood since then, swelling it outward. She pressed her ear to the planks, silence, and then, faintly, beneath the wood knock. "Knock, knock," she jerked back, heart racing, but this time the sound didn't stop. It spread. The knocking echoed up through the hole against the walls, as though the entire boat itself had become a drum. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from the same unknown number. "It's awake. It's later." That day, Ellen met with Dr. Leah Grayson again, bringing her photographs of the corroded bones. Leah examined them with a pale face. "These marks," she said, tracing a circle on the image, "aren't consistent with natural decay. They look parasitic, like something bored into the bone. Marine worms can do this, but not in this pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Ellen asked. Leah hesitated. "It looks deliberate. It's almost like writing." Ellen felt her stomach. "Twist writing?" Leah nodded. "Not in any language I know, but repeating symbols, like something was trying to leave a message on the body itself." Ellen thought of the scratches inside the compartment, of the words carved into the cabin. "IT follows. Messages. Warnings." Carved in desperation. But what if the bones themselves were carrying a message too? That night, Ellen sat in her motel room, staring at the photographs. She traced the strange pockmarks with her finger, trying to connect them. Slowly, painfully, the shapes began to resemble something: circles, lines, jagged strokes. Her phone buzzed again. New message. This one contained only 3 words. "It's in you." Her hands went cold. She dropped the phone as if it had burned. Her dot, and then, in the silence, she heard it again. Knock, knock. But this time, it wasn't from the bathroom. It was from inside her chest. At first, Ellen thought it was her imagination. The knocking inside her chest was faint, a dull reverberation that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. But as she sat in the silence of her motel room, she realized it wasn't her pulse. It was slower, deliberate. Knock, knock. She pressed her palm against her sternum, panic rising. The sound vibrated through her ribs. Each strike felt heavier than the last, as though something deep inside was pressing outward, testing the barrier of her body. No, she whispered, clutching at her shirt. No, no, no. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Open the door! She hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She stumbled to the sink, splashed cold water on her face, and stared into the mirror. Her reflection looked pale, her eyes wide with terror. She leaned closer and saw condensation forming on the glass. Letters traced themselves slowly across the fog, as if drawn by invisible fingers. She staggered back, knocking over the chair by Dawn. Ellen drove back to Harrington, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She needed answers, and the only place left to find them was the windbreaker. The pier was nearly deserted when she arrived. The guards had thin budget cuts, or maybe no one wanted to be stationed near the cursed vessel anymore. The boat sat quietly, rocking in the tide. The rising sun painting its wet boards gold. Ellen boarded with grim resolve. The air inside was damp, suffocating. Salt water pooled in the corners, though the tide hadn't reached that high. The woods seemed to breathe faintly beneath her boots. She crouched near the trapdoor again. This time she didn't press her ear to it. She spoke aloud. I know you. Can hear me? Silence. Thomas Barlow. If you're in there. If any part of you is still in there. Single, slow knock answered from beneath the planks. Her throat tightened. What do you want? The response came quickly. Knock, 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 3 times. The same rhythm she'd heard in her chest. She staggered back, heart racing. Whatever had followed Thomas all those years ago, it was trying to claim her too. Later that day, Ellen met again with Dr. Leah Grayson. She brought her the photographs of the bone markings. Leah had spent the night analyzing them further. There. Not random, Leah said. They repeat in sequences, almost like code. Look, this pattern appears on 3 different ribs. Ellen leaned closer. The symbols looked like jagged circles with slashes through them, arranged in lines. What do they mean? Ellen asked. I don't know, but they're intentional. Someone or something was trying to communicate through the body. Ellen's stomach twisted. Through Carter's body, Leah hesitated. Detective, has anything strange happened? To you, since you boarded that boat. Ellen's eyes flicked away. Why do you ask? Because I've been reading about maritime folklore in that region. There are legends about entities that use vessels as gateways. They mark bodies, objects, anything they touch, leaving signs for the next person. It's parasitic. Ellen thought of the knocking in her chest, the words on the mirror, the text messages. It's already in me, she whispered. Leah frowned. What do you mean? Before Ellen could answer, her phone buzzed. Another message. This one wasn't from a number, just blank space at the top of the screen. The sea. It's hungry. The letters bled across her phone, dripping down the screen like water. Leah's face went pale. Detective, whatever this is, it isn't just folklore. That night, Ellen couldn't bring herself to sleep. She sat awake, lights on, pistol in her lap. Around 2 a.m., the air grew heavy. The lights flickered, and from somewhere deep in the walls, the knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. Only this time, it wasn't just in her chest. It was all around her. She covered her ears, but it made no difference. The sound vibrated through her bones, her teeth, her skull. Then faintly, beneath the pounding, she heard a voice. Wet, hollow, familiar. Ellen. Her blood ran cold. It was Thomas Barlow, and he was whispering from inside her own body. Ellen didn't move. Her entire body went rigid. Her fingers tightening around the pistol in her lap until her knuckles whitened. The voice, Thomas's voice, hadn't come from the room. It hadn't come from the phone. It had come from inside. Her own chest. Ellen. It whispered again, wet and ragged, like air bubbling through waterlogged lungs. She dropped the gun. Her hands clawed at her throat, as if she could drag the sound out of herself. Stop! Stop! The room fell silent. The buzzing in the walls, the knocking, everything, it all stopped. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then, slowly, the floorboards beneath her feet began to ripple, not creak, not shift, ripple like water swelling beneath a thin membrane. Ellen scrambled back, heart hammering. The cheap carpet warped and bulged. Dark spots of moisture spread outward in a circular pattern, and then knock, knock from the floor. Her phone lit up again where it lay on the nightstand. The screen showed another message. No number, no name. Open the door. By morning. Ellen was hollow-eyed and shaking, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had been trapped in the windbreaker was no longer bound to the boat. It had followed her out. She drove to Leah Grayson's lab, nearly running 2 red lights on the way. Leah saw her pallor and sat her down immediately. You look like you haven't slept in days. I haven't, Ellen muttered. It's in me, Leah. It's inside me. It talks to me. Leah studied her carefully, then gestured to the bone photographs spread across her desk. If this thing is using the human body as a vessel, maybe the markings are instructions, warnings, or even a ritual. Ellen shook her head. It doesn't want to warn. It wants to feed. Leah hesitated, then lowered her voice. There's a sailor's tale about what they called the hollow tide, a presence in the sea that consumes people but leaves behind echoes voices. Shadows, pieces of the drowned. They say once it touches you, you belong to it, no matter where you go. Ellen's hands trembled. So what am I supposed to do? Let it take me. Leah leaned closer. No, we need to find where it began, where Thomas Barlow first heard the knocking. That night, Ellen returned to the archives. The microfiche reels, the yellowed clippings, the forgotten fragments of 1987. She found a small article buried between fishing reports. Local fisherman claims voices in the deep. Before disappearance, it described how, weeks before he vanished, Thomas Barlow had told his brother that he'd heard knocking coming from beneath his boat at night. He believed something in the ocean was trying to get aboard. The article ended with a detail that made Ellen's blood freeze. Barlow claimed the sound had followed him home. Into his own walls, into his own body. 2 days later, Ellen stood on the rocky shore where Barlow's boat had last been seen. The sea was calm, deceptively peaceful. Leah had insisted on coming with her, though she kept casting nervous glances at the water. Are you sure about this? Leah asked. Ellen gripped the railing of the old dock. It started here. If there's a way to end it, it has to be here. The water lapped gently at the pilings. For a moment, the quiet almost soothed her. 8. Then faintly, it began again. Knock, 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 this time not from her chest. Not from her phone. From beneath the dock. Leah backed away. Ellen stepped forward, staring down into the black water. The surface shimmered. Shapes moved just beneath shadows that looked almost human, and then, breaking the surface, a hand rose, bloated, pale. Fingers webbed with strands of kelp. It gripped the edge of the dock with unnatural strength. Leah screamed. Ellen couldn't. Move, she watched, horrified, as more hands broke the water around them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, each one clawing for purchase, dragging itself upward. The drowned were rising, and their leader, the first figure to pull itself fully from the sea, was Thomas Barlow, his empty eyes locked on hers. Water streamed from his mouth as he whispered, Ellen, you're already one of us. The air reeked of salt and rot. Thomas Barlow's corpse stood dripping on the dock, skin gray and blistered, ribs showing through tattered flesh. Behind him, dozens more climbed from the waves, men and women with barnacle-crusted jaws, eyes like hollow sockets, mouths that whispered through streams of brine. Leah staggered backward, hand clamped over her mouth. God, oh my God. Ellen forced herself to stand firm. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but something deeper, something darker kept her rooted. "Thomas," she whispered. The drowned man tilted his head. "You hear us now. You carry us. You belong." Behind him, the chorus of voices swelled. They didn't shout. They didn't roar. They murmured in unison, a sick lullaby rising with the tide. Knock, knock, knock. The sound wasn't from wood or water anymore. It was inside Ellen's bones. Leah grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now." But Ellen didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Thomas, whose bloated hand extended toward her like a priest offering salvation. "Step forward," he whispered. "Finish what began in 1987. They barely made it back to the car." Leah dragged Ellen, nearly throwing her into the passenger seat before flooring the gas. Tires spun on wet gravel, throwing up mist as they sped away from the rising horde. Neither of them spoke for miles. The silence in the car was worse than the murmuring outside. Finally, Ellen said, "They're not going to stop. You saw it." "Want me?" Leah's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "Not just you. That wasn't random. They're building something. Gathering." Ellen turned to her, eyes hollow. "What if I'm the door?" That night, Leah insisted they go back to her lab. She had locked the bone fragments, photographs, and artifacts away, but even sealed inside steel drawers. Ellen could feel them throbbing like a heartbeat. Leah spread the photographs out again, tracing the etchings along one rib. "These markings, it's not random, it's a map. Or instructions." Ellen leaned closer. "Instructions for what?" Leah swallowed hard. "For crossing over." Ellen's stomach turned. "Crossing from where?" Leah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The walls of the lab gave a sudden groan, the lights flickering. From somewhere deep inside the ventilation ducts, the knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. Leah swore under her breath. "It's spreading. They're not bound to the ocean anymore. They're bleeding into every place connected to you." Buried her face in her hands. "Then I need to go back." Leah spun toward her. "Are you insane? Back to the water? That's suicide." "No." Ellen's voice was steady now, almost calm. "It's the only way. If I'm the door, then I'm the only one who can close it." By dawn, Ellen had made her choice. She left. Leah behind, ignoring her friend's desperate protests, and drove alone to the coast. The same dock, the same black water. The ocean was unnaturally still. Not a wave broke. Not a gull cried. Silence pressed against her skull until her ears rang. She walked to the edge and looked down. At first, nothing. Just her reflection, pale and exhausted. Then, slowly, the water shimmered. Her reflection began to change. Her eyes darkened. Her skin bloated. Her lips cracked open to reveal seawater streaming from within. Her reflection smiled at her. And then it whispered in Thomas Barlow's voice and her own overlapping, "It's time." The dock shuddered. Hands erupted from beneath the water, clawing upward again, but this time Ellen didn't recoil. She stepped closer. Thomas emerged first. Dripping kelp and brine, his jaw unhinged unnaturally wide, splitting as though to swallow her whole. Ellen lifted her arms almost in surrender. "If I'm the door, then close me." For a heartbeat, the drowned froze. Murmuring ceased. The sea held its breath. Then Thomas lunged and Ellen jumped forward into the black water. Before he could reach her, the surface slammed shut behind her. Cold enveloped her instantly, crushing from all sides. The world went dark, but she wasn't drowning. She was falling. Endless depths stretched below, not water, but void. Shapes swam around her, too many to count. Twisted things with hollow faces and long skeletal arms. They whispered as they circled, brushing her skin, testing her. Somewhere far beneath, Ellen saw a tan opening. A vast glowing wound in the ocean floor. A door, and it was wide open. The abyss pulled Ellen downward, deeper than light could ever reach. She expected the pressure to crush her, her lungs to burn, but instead the void welcomed her. Her body no longer felt human. It stretched, pulled thin like cloth in water. Every nerve alive with static around her swam the dead. Dozens, no hundreds of figures with faces warped by rot and time. Thomas Barlow among them, his ruined eyes locked onto hers. He opened his mouth, and the voice that came was not his alone. You are the hinge, the gate. The tide turns on. Ellen's chest heaved, not with breath, but with a heartbeat she realized wasn't hers anymore. Something ancient throbbed inside her. The glowing wound in the ocean floor pulsed, opening wider with every beat. It wasn't a door to death. It was a door to something else, and it was hungry. On the surface, Leah stood on the dock, screaming Ellen's name into the still morning. She had chased her here, but she was too late. The water had already sealed. The sea was unnaturally calm, mirror flat. And then the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. Leah dropped to her knees. Please, please don't. From beneath the surface, faintly at first, the drowned began to rise again. Their faces were different this time. Not just Thomas, not just strangers, but newer faces. Faces Leah recognized from photographs, missing persons reports, old newspapers, dozens of the lost. And then she saw Ellen. Her face. Bloated, pale, lips blue, eyes glowing faintly like the wound beneath the waves. She floated just below the surface, hair drifting like kelp, but she was smiling. Beneath the water, Ellen hovered before the vast, pulsing door. The whispers of the drowned wrapped around her like chains. You can hold it closed, Thomas said, his voice brittle, or you can let it open. Choose. Ellen stared at him, at all of them. She felt the weight of their endless years pressing. Against her mind, their hunger, their sorrow. I won't let you through, she said. Her voice was barely her own now, reverberated, doubled, stretched. This ends with me. She reached toward the door. The instant her hand touched its glowing edge, searing agony tore through her body. It felt like being ripped apart and burned alive, but she didn't let go. She clung to the wound in the ocean like a dam holding back a flood. The drowned screamed. Their voices tore through the blackness, clawing at her mind. Still, Ellen held. On the dock, Leah fell forward, sobbing, as the drowned began to sink again. Their forms unraveled like smoke underwater, pulled downward into the depths. One by one, the ripples faded. The sea went still again. But Ellen's face did not reappear. Leah leaned over the edge, searching the glassy water. All she saw was her own reflection staring back at her then. Faintly, just below the surface, something knocked from the deep. Knock, knock, knock. Leah froze. Her throat closed. Because this time, the knocking wasn't asking to come in. It was asking her to let Ellen out. In the months that followed, locals whispered that the sea had gone quiet again. No more strange disappearances. No more ghostly lights. Some said it was over, but Leah knew better. She avoided the dock, avoided the sea, avoided even talking about it. But sometimes in the dead of night she would hear it again, three dull thuds echoing inside her chest, as though the knock had followed her inland. Each time, she thought of Ellen, and each time she wondered how long a door could stay closed before it needed to open again.